up, and I have the pleasure to officially start this 2 days series of webinar on the pathogen access and benefit sharing annex that is being negotiated at the WHO. This series of webinars is being co-organized by the Geneva Global Health Hub, Third World Network, Public Service International, and PHM. And also a few logistic, if you want to listen to the webinar in Spanish, which is the interpretation that we have, you can click on the globe and choose the Spanish option. So without further ado, I would then maybe start the webinar giving a few background information related to this PABS annex. So as you all know, the World Health Assembly 78 in May 2025 approved and adopted the pandemic treaty. However, the pandemic treaty that has been adopted, it's a pandemic treaty which still does not explain very well how the so-called PABS system, which is articulated in Article 12, work. And the reason why there is this, let's call it a gap, was that because of time constraints and because of very, very different position among developing countries and developed countries, it was not possible to reach a final agreement by May 2025. So when the pandemic agreement was adopted at the World Health Assembly 79, it was also decided to establish a so-called intergovernmental working group, which would have worked for the next year in order to prepare an annex to the pandemic agreement in which the clear architecture and functioning of this pathogen access and benefit sharing system would be better explained. So flash forward to, let's say, March, February, so a few weeks ago, the Intergovernmental Working Group has started gathering after the WHA 78 in May, but unfortunately, the work that has been carried on until now has not really been, we could say, very successful, because the very same problems that we could find in May 2025 are still persistent today. And those are divisions on very important issues that are the issues that we want to dig deeper a little bit in these 2 days. So there are issues about contract, so the creation of legally binding instruments. They are the issue of intellectual property, and those are also the issues regarding to open anonymous access to the PABS, to the pathogens databases, and the databases that will host genomic sequence informations and data, versus let's say still open but more, let's say, controlled access via user registration. And as you can see, picking one or the other option will really have big consequences on the whole framework and architecture of the PABS system, and also in its capacity to actually deliver a fair and equitable pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. And we also have clear consequences on the very same operationalization of the pandemic agreement. Borrowing like the word that were used by developing countries, member states, I think it was Malaysia, but I'm not sure. The PABS system is actually the heart. So if we create a system, a heart that is well functioning, we will also have a body, a pandemic treaty that will be well functioning and will also be will deliver in terms of equity and fairness. If we are creating a heart that is defective, then of course this will have huge consequences also also for the value of the pandemic agreement and the global capacity of answering to pandemics in the long terms and in the future. And it's very easy to understand and to see how, since we are now in March and the WHA 79 is in May, so a little, it's actually 2 months ahead, it's very easy to understand how there is a lot of pressures. The pressure is mounting, and because we do not have much more time left. And we know that the coming intergovernmental working group, the Intergovernmental Working Group 6, that will gather at the end of March, will actually be the last official negotiation process before the adoption of the PABS Annex in May 2026. So with today, with this, and tomorrow, with this series of webinars, a part of conducting a deep dive into the issues that are like the contended issues within this draft PABS Annex, we also would like to entice you to really please join if you can, join IGWG 6, deliver that statement. If you want, if you're interested, please write that policy brief, speak to that government, to the diplomats that maybe can support in changing also the fate of the negotiations. And in order to do this exercise, I am supported today by a beautiful panel of speakers that I will present one by one afterwards when they will be speaking. But they are Sangeeta Shashikan from the Third World Network, Pedro Vilardi from PSI, Alan Maleche, and Alexandra Phelan. And I would invite now Sangeeta Shashikan, which is a legal advisor, coordinator of the Development and Intellectual Property Program at Third World Network, to maybe set the framework and provide an overview on why contractual mechanisms are essential for operationalizing the PABS system, and what is the problem with the intellectual property, why addressing intellectual property is critical.
But thank you very much for the introduction. So my presentation is really to just give an overview of two very important issues, the issue of contracts and the issue of intellectual property. And the reason, I focused on these issues is these are, I would say, two very important aspects of the PABS system, which in a way is a litmus test of whether there is equity in the system, right? As we know, intellectual property is always a very hot topic, in any of these international negotiations. And we are talking here, the context is a bit different, right? The context is not the usual context. The context is one of pandemic preparedness and response. So, I think we have to look at these issues through that lens, right? So I want to just go through the issue of why contracts are very important for equity, in the PABS system. Now, when we look at PABS, PABS is Pathogen Access and Benefit Sharing System. Now, internationally, there are very clear rules on access and benefit sharing, and the mother convention is really the Convention on Biological Diversity. And I just want to go through very quickly, what does the Convention on Biological Diversity say? It's very clear that the sovereign rights of states, the states have sovereign rights over their genetic resources and access. The authority to determine access depends on national governments. And where access is granted, it has to be on mutually agreed terms. And then it should also address benefits arising from the commercial and other utilization of genetic resources. Now, typically, when we look at mutually agreed terms, we have the Nagoya Protocol, which is a very specific protocol on access and benefit sharing. And it says that, there should be established clear rules and procedures for requiring and establishing mutually agreed terms. And this should be set out in writing. There should be a dispute, it can include things like dispute settlement clause, terms of benefit sharing, how to address intellectual property, terms on subsequent third-party use, changes of intent. So if you were using it for non-commercial use and then there's a change in intent, how would you address it? So what is very clear is that when we look at PABS, PABS is really creating a multilateral access and benefit sharing system for a very specific genetic resource, pathogen with pandemic potential. And the PABS system has to align itself, has to be consistent with the objectives and elements of internationally established rules on access and benefit sharing, which is the CBD and the Nagoya Protocol. And typically, Nagoya Protocol and CBD looks at ABS based on from a national perspective. That means to say, and when you have when you're sharing, giving access to biological resources and the recipient is getting access, there normally would be a contractual arrangement, the mutually agreed terms, right? So now we are applying the same principles at the international level in the context of WHO pandemic agreement. And so, the approach should be the same. And if you look at the European EU regulation, European Parliament, they themselves agree that mutually agreed terms refers to contractual arrangements, and these contractual arrangements will set out specific conditions for fair and equitable benefit sharing. But it's not just about fair and equitable benefit sharing. It will also address further conditions and terms for such utilization and subsequent application. So as I mentioned, if you look at what that means is that there should be the terms of use. When you share biological material, the contractual arrangements should specify what are the terms of use of the shared resources, as well as the fair and equitable benefit sharing. So as I mentioned, just going back, is that when we look at what the contractual arrangement should have, you will see Article 6 of the Nagoya Protocol flags some of the key issues that should be addressed in a contract. Now, I also want to stress that what is being proposed at the international level, and if you've not been following the PABS negotiations, you may not be aware, the Global South, the developing countries generally would like to see standard contracts being applied to the sharing of pathogen material and sequence information. But this is strongly opposed by the European Union, Norway, and other G6 countries, okay? Although, as I showed you, the EU regulation itself, when we talk about implementing ABS itself, is talking about contractual arrangements, okay? So that is the approach they're already taking domestically. And if you look at how sharing happens domestically in countries in relation to other biological materials or even pathogen material, or even any kind of data, you will find that actually material transfer agreements, data transfer agreements, data access agreements, I have also heard data material access and data access agreement, they combine, like there are different versions of it. But if you look at it, it is very clear that the practice, the norm is to underpin it with standard contracts. You may call it material transfer agreement, data, depending on what you are transferring, right? So this is a very important fundamental principle that a practice, not just principle, practice that is already being implemented nationally. It's also rooted in how ABS should work. And multilaterally as well, we have got 15 years of experience with WHO's pandemic influenza preparedness framework. There are 2 standard material transfer agreements, and these agreements have been signed with manufacturers, vaccine and antiviral manufacturers, academic institutions, other product manufacturers. Now, these are not perfect agreements for sure because it was negotiated by WHO, but it does give a certain level of legal certainty, because if you look at SMTA2s, they have agreed in the SMTA2s with manufacturers agreed to give a certain percentage of real-time production of vaccine, flu pandemic vaccine to WHO during a pandemic. Now, this is coming from at a time, before PIP, there was no such agreement. And so WHO had to scramble for getting access. Developing countries had to scramble to get access. At least with PIP, there is some contracts in place that puts WHO at the front of the queue. Now, after PIP, we have seen in COVID as well, when COVID struck, and after COVID, Mpox, right? Access was just not available, right? To those that needed it, especially many of the developing countries. So that is a problem. WHO itself could not get access to support countries. And in the meantime, we saw, especially in COVID, companies made billions of dollars. I mean, billions and billions of dollars from the sales of various products. So the idea is really to bring back equity into the discussion and see if we can create a fairer system when we are dealing with, with respect to the pathogens with pandemic potential. Now, one of the arguments we have been hearing from the EU, which is nonsensical, is that they keep saying our public research institutions cannot be expected to sign the standard material transfer agreements. There are just too many standard material transfer agreements. But if you look at the plant treaty, they have themselves a standard material transfer agreement, which is predominantly signed by public research institutes, and there are more than 100,000 that have been signed. I think in this current digital era, you can do a lot of things technologically to actually facilitate the rapid signing of these agreements, provided they are standardized, right? Of course, this is again objected by the European Union. And as I've mentioned already, domestically as well, that is what is widely used. So I just want to come back to Article 12 for the pandemic agreement. What does it say? Why do we need standard contracts, right? Article 12, I think there are two very fundamental principles which are there in the pandemic agreement. One is the equal footing principle. That is that if there is a commitment on parties to provide rapid and timely sharing of materials and sequence information, there should be, on an equal footing, a similar rapid and timely equitable sharing of benefits, right? And I'm going to come to this. And second is the issue of legal certainty of terms and conditions, not just on access, but also on benefit sharing. So both access and benefit sharing, it says very clearly there should be the modalities and terms and conditions should provide legal certainty. So these are two very important parameters on which the PABS annex is to be built on. And there are a few others, but I wanted to flag these two. So we want to, the importance of standardized enforceable contracts, is that this should apply to all recipients. They should not pick and choose. Certain category of recipients should sign it and not other categories of recipients. And this should be agreed prior to access. And I think this is fundamental if we are to see an effective and equitable PABS system. Now, the standardized enforceable contracts are very important to operationalize the principles, as I mentioned, of equal footing and legal certainty. The annex of the pandemic agreement, the provisions in the PABS annex, are not directly binding on the recipients of this material. So it will not be binding on the universities get access, on the manufacturers that get access, other commercial users that get access, right? It is only binding on the parties. So the text will say, okay, parties will have to share PABS pathogen samples, materials, and sequence information. But then without contract, there is no corresponding obligations on recipients directly. Okay, so it is very important on the basis of principle of equal footing, and also for the legal certainty that we have these contracts, because then the recipients are also equally bound by enforceable contracts to deliver what they're supposed to deliver in terms of compliance with the PABS system, but also fair and equitable benefit sharing. Very important is that it clarifies the obligations. Okay, what does a contract do? It will clarify what are the terms and conditions of using the material and the sequence information. For instance, if a lab is taking the material, the PABS material, and generates sequence information, which now is very easy for even any entity to do. It's quite cheap, it's quite accessible. So sequences can be generated. Now the question is, what is the responsibility, for instance, of the recipient? Right? If the recipient is just going to make available everything it generates or whatever material it gets to whoever that wants it, then it undermines the entire PABS system, because that will lead to free riders, who are also have not taken on similar commitments. So it is very important to clarify, the contracts will clarify the obligations of the particular user. Enforceable benefit sharing commitments, because at the end of the day, we can put a lot of provisions, benefits in the annex, but if they are not enforceable on the recipients, then what is the point, right? Then you are not going to get equity on the benefit sharing side. Meanwhile, countries have taken on the obligation to share material. So again, it would not be on an equal footing if there wasn't enforceable benefit sharing commitments. Traceability and accountability. So the recipients who are getting access, should have certain accountability measures, like, commitments that they have to comply with, maybe even report back, etc. Right? So it ensures certain kind of accountability on the recipients. Onward transfer is addressing it is very important. I'm going to come back to it. I already spoke about free riding, and contracts build trust. They allow for us to put in place provisions to protect public health, right? And I'm going to speak about this on the issue of intellectual property. It also protects the rights of the provider countries, and of course, it promotes compliance. You can elaborate what are the consequences of non-compliance, dispute resolution, and very importantly, without all of this, what we are then creating is really a system. If we do not have this kind of components, we're actually creating a system that is going to be promoting biopiracy. So if there is clarity on the obligations of the recipients, and it's enforceable, it is fair, equitable, we can prevent biopiracy. But as we will see now, this is the text that was released yesterday by the Bureau, which is largely accommodating the demands of the European Union and G6. There is no mention of standard contracts, and they make a distinction, as you can see here in blue. WHO PABS contracts is only for entities for commercial purposes, and the others, there is only mention of terms and conditions, right? There is no reference to standard contracts. Not clear why we need to make this distinction, because as I've shown you, the use of contracts are very common with laboratories, with even for entities that are using it for non-commercial purposes. Now there is this language of a material transfer agreement. Again, this is all very vague. Yeah, it's not even clear what material transfer agreement it is referring to, whether it's like something we are going to be negotiating or not, and what it's going to apply to. So that is very vague. I think if you look at the text, there is no mention of standard contracts, and this should be a concern for all of us. As I mentioned, this would mean it's inconsistent with the equal footing principle, because the parties in the annex, they have taken on commitment to share PABS material and sequence information, but then there is no corresponding commitment on the part of entities that are using it for non-commercial purposes, also recognized databases. And we're going to talk about databases a bit more tomorrow. Sorry,
sorry
too
to
fast?
Yes.
Yeah, I just, yeah.
A bit more.
Apologize to the interpreters, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Now, one very important thing I want to flag is the issue of onward transfer. It is very common for contracts to address the issue of onward transfer. It's either prohibited, some contracts prohibit it, some contracts say that you can transfer it provided the third party that is receiving the material has also agreed to the same terms and conditions. This is addressed in the PIP framework, which says that the recipient shall only transfer the PIP biological material if the prospective recipient has concluded an SMTA, Standard Material Transfer Agreement, with WHO. Okay, now the importance here lies in the fact that manufacturers don't just take the material and then just share with another third party. Same thing with any academic institutions. They should not be allowed to just take the material and sequence information and freely share with any other third party. That is not going to ever be bound by any terms and conditions, because this is really then extracting from the provider countries and promoting biopiracy. Right? So we see that it is a very common provision that you see in contracts. I also put the Oslo University Material Transfer Agreement there. They do not allow onward transfer. And then you have the European Molecular Biology Laboratory, which says that it cannot be released to any other person other than the recipient researcher and even just the staff below them. Right? And it shall not be forwarded onwards without written approval. So these are very common provisions that you would see in contracts. Now, when we look at the Bureau's text, the latest Bureau's text, there is some language about the WCLN, which is a WHO Coordinated Laboratory Network. But here, note that this is not a defined concept in the Bureau's text. And this already it's a problem, because the way WHO Secretariat is approaching WCLN is they are saying that any network out there that they are coordinating can be part of it. And they have really vast networks out there, and I'm going to come to this, which is already, engaged in dubious practice, I think inconsistent with international ABS law. But I want to flag here that there is no explicit conditions on onward transfers that apply to other recipients, such as entities accessing for commercial use or non-commercial use. So you could very well be an academic institution and taking materials out from the PABS system, and even sequence information, but then there is no clear conditions on prohibition of onward transfer. For instance, you can say, the text could have said you can transfer provided the prospective recipient has agreed to the same terms and conditions with WHO. So it's not about preventing onward transfer, but ensuring that it is regulated so that it does not undermine the PABS system. Because if we freely allow onward transfer, then what happens is that the PABS system will not last after beyond a year, because the entire system will be undermined by free riders. Yeah. And of course, that would affect fair and equitable benefit sharing. And that would actually mean that WHO is developing a PABS system that is engaged in biopiracy. Yeah. I just flagged this article that we have written. In the last Intergovernmental Working Group, WHO released a concept note on some of its networks that is engaged in relation to pathogens of epidemic and pandemic potential. And, we have looked at it, and, I think our concern is the whole approach of these entire networks. And there are many different networks. Some of these networks have about 300 over entities, 100 over 200 over entities that are part of it. And, the concern is to what extent these networks are actually complying with international rules on ABS. So I just addressed very quickly, I'm a bit beyond my time, on intellectual property, just a few slides. So intellectual property, is always a hot topic, a very contentious topic, because the developed countries normally do not want to address this in any other way than to allow, unconditional claiming of intellectual property. So before I come to that, I just flag that actually TWN has done some research in this area. And, we found that when it comes to pathogens that cause health emergencies, there are many different entities that claim patents. And we just looked at patents, right? When we look at intellectual property, that can cover patents, that can cover trade secrets. Our publication was more on patents. And they claim all sorts of types of patents, It can be over the sequence, parts of the sequence, native, vaccine compositions, recombinant protein. And it is not just claimed by manufacturers of vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics, but it's also claimed by other commercial manufacturers and other commercial users as well. But we found at least the, Mariel that is engaged, which is Boehringer, that is engaged in developing animal vaccines as well, right? So the human pathogen sequence information can actually be used to develop other products for the animal sector. So there are other commercial users, and so patent claims can be made for other users as well. Now, as we have come from, COVID-19, there has been a lot of discussion about how intellectual property and patents in particular, but not just that, even trade secret, can actually hinder and erect barriers to access, can erect barriers to R&D. Yeah, I mean, some of the legal challenges that companies were taking each other during COVID-19, for instance, in relation to mRNA technology, are still ongoing. But let me come to the text which you see on intellectual property in the latest Bureau's text. So they come back to the same old provision that you also see in other in international SMTA, which is that not to claim intellectual property over the material and the sequence information or the genetic parts or component in the form received. So whatever is being shared, the participants of the PABS system cannot claim IP over the material and the sequence information. But then it's in the form received. But then it stops there. It does not go much further. Now, if you look at the kinds of patents that are claimed, that are filed for, it can be over the derivatives, it can be over the modified versions, it can be over the results of any kind of R&D that has been done with the PABS material and sequence information. Now, herein lies the inequity, because provider countries, with the establishment of the PABS system, are being asked to give away their sovereign rights, are being asked to replace their national law requirements in terms of ABS when it comes to dealing with pathogens with pandemic potential, right? They are being asked to share this material and sequence information. Only then for the derivatives, modified versions, results to be appropriated through the intellectual property system, right? So again, how is this consistent with the equal footing principle? And as I mentioned, the context here is not the normal context. The context here is pandemic preparedness and response. How are we allowing the creation of monopolies over public health, right? So, we are allowing the creation of monopolies rather than having more pro-public health mechanisms that are more suitable to realize the objective of the pandemic agreement. I think there's some language issue in what I've written. The other point is that, as I've shown you, the participants of the PABS system cover WHO coordinated laboratory network entities, which is again not defined, as I mentioned, entities, sequence databases, entities using for non-commercial purposes, as well as entities using for commercial purposes. Now, if you look at text, various contracts that you see in some of the developed countries, you will see that the minute you apply, any entity applies for patents, it's not treated as a non-commercial entity for non-commercial use. It is treated as commercial use. Okay, but here the Bureau does not make any such distinction, and it treats everyone the same way. And so the question is, why do we allow entities that are taking it for non-commercial use to apply for intellectual property and to erect barriers? And so I guess the question is, if we are having this instrument for pandemic preparedness and response, shouldn't we have a more progressive public health oriented approach to intellectual property, rather than just allowing everybody to claim all sorts of intellectual property and to create monopolies? So here I just want to show you that if you look at the terms of reference of the coronavirus network of WHO, it has some interesting provision here, which says that when it comes to commercial assays, provisions to give effect that the commercial exploitation of any intellectual property, including the ownership of know-how, arising from such commercial essay and or development shall be designed to achieve the general availability of the product and the availability of the product to the public health sector of developing countries on preferential terms and in sufficient quantities to meet the demand. And it says here already that the participating laboratory shall have first entered into an agreement with WHO concerning commercial assay development. So they do not allow WHO designated laboratories to just claim intellectual property, right? It's always conditioned in a way that is pro-public health. And that's how it should be. And I give you I'm just in my last 2 slides. There is this paper, guidance, if you like, on model clauses by the Swiss on agreement on ABS. And here, for non-commercial research, it says that if user wants to obtain intellectual property right on research results, such act shall be treated as a change in utilization and shall be regulated under Article 7, which is about change of utilization from non-commercial to commercial use, right? And then it says that the ownership of the IPR and distribution of the value derived from IPR are to be negotiated. So I think we really have to think about how we can address the issue of intellectual property in a much more pro-public health oriented way. And I think that is very important because we always talk about intellectual property, and to end up saying that, we want countries to share samples and sequence information only for it to be then appropriated and to erect barriers. While intellectual property, some may say, is important for R&D, it can also erect barriers to R&D. And I think in this area of pathogens with pandemic potential, especially, a lot of the R&D is driven by public funds. So I think we have to question what kind of formulation is equitable and would be appropriate in the context of what we are discussing, which is pandemic preparedness and response. Because I think it would be I guess very disappointing to have a system that in the end just ends up erecting more monopolies, right? Because that does not get us very far in pandemic preparedness and response. So thank you very much. I apologize if I took more time.
Thank you so much, Sangeeta, for this very absolutely needed and also detailed overview. I really liked your last slide with this little comic that I think really explains much better than words could do what could actually happen if the proposals from the European Union go through. I am very happy now to introduce you to our next speaker, which is Pedro Villardi. He is the Global Coordinator for Health Equity at Public Services International. And with you, Pedro, I would like to focus on the political and global equity dimension of the PABS negotiations from the perspective of civil society and also from the perspective of developing countries, because you represent Public Service International, which is representing by itself millions of workers that provide public services. So my question to you is, what would be your message to the WHO member states that are opposing all those measures that would actually enable the realization of a more equitable and fair PABS system? I am thinking about the European Union, Germany, Norway, Japan, and Switzerland. So what is maybe your argument for dismantling their position against contracts and also against clear benefit sharing provisions, such, for example, the stockpiling for fakes? And how could we address IP in a way that does not enable the creation of barriers against access to vaccine therapeutics and diagnostics. So a little bit to follow along what Sangeeta was concluding.
Thank you so much, Alessandra. Thanks, TWN, for putting this panel together, all other organizations participating here, to our audience. This is a critical issue. And Alessandra, I'd like to start with a remark saying that for me, it's crucial that we say vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostic instead of VTDs, because we must always have in mind that we are talking about life-saving technologies. We're like talking about life-saving medicines, vaccines. And when we talk about an acronym, it seems that it's just another technicality that we can treat as something else, right? So I always like to talk about medicines. I like to vaccines and not, acronyms and other things like this. And my message would be that this is the moment we need to go beyond the status quo. PSI has been saying that for quite some time now. This is an opportunity that we have, an opportunity that it cost a lot of lives, because we are only having this discussion because of the COVID-19 pandemic, which took thousands of health and care workers from us, right? I'd like to start by introducing PSI. Public Services International is a global union federation representing more than 30 million workers working in public services worldwide. We are present in more than 150 countries. And about half of those workers, more than 15 million workers, are health and care workers. So this is a critical issue for us. For us, it's a matter of answering these questions, right? The PABS system will be a message of hope, a system of hope or false promise. And I'd like to remind our audience of the human costs in terms of health workers during the COVID pandemic. This is underestimated figures. Only in the first year of the pandemic, 2020 until March 2021, the WHO estimates that more than 17,000 health workers died facing the COVID-19 pandemic. This is mainly in low and middle income countries where health and care workers face the virus unprotected. And we must remember that while the high income countries had already vaccinated their population with 4 shots, some low middle income countries still could not have their health and care workers vaccinated. The frontline workers that were still facing the pandemic, they couldn't receive 1 shot, while high middle income countries had already given 4 shots to their population. So this is the level of inequality that we need to face here. This is the reality of the facts. And this is the status quo. So by mid-2021, high middle income countries had more than 100 doses per 100 people, while low income countries had less than 2 doses per 100 people by mid-2021. So we're talking about a 20 months difference. We're talking about almost 2 years in between population, nearly the whole population of high-income countries were vaccinated, when the low-income countries started to vaccinate their health and care workforce. I'm not talking about the whole population. I'm talking about here health and care workers. So by the time that the whole population of high income countries were fully vaccinated, with a coverage up to 80%. The low-income countries were 2 years after that, the low-income countries were starting to vaccinate their priority, the priority people, and that means the health and care workers. So the promise was, when we talk about the PABS system, right? When the WHO approved the pandemic text in 2026, so that was in 2025, May last year, right? The promise when we separated the Article 12 was to have an equitable access and benefit sharing system, countries sharing pathogens and receiving vaccines and treatments, transparency and accountability and traceability, and a fair distribution of medical countermeasures, right? And the reality is that until now, we have anonymous access to pathogen data. We have no binding contracts and obligations. We are just around the corner of the next WHA, and this is the reality that we have so far. So developing countries will remain last in line for receiving vaccines, and the profits, as we stand now, they will be privatized and the risks socialized, right? So PSI is deeply concerned about the unbalanced nature of a system that is also reflected in other sectors of our society. That we have a lot of benefits to the private companies, the public share the risks so that the private can profit from them. This happens in nearly all sectors: energy, water, sanitation, health, and this is happening also with the PABS system that is being negotiated now in the WHO. So we listed the three critical battles in these negotiations. So we need a public governance. We need a public-led governance, a WHO-governed pathogen database, instead of having private databases with no accountability whatsoever. We need user registration. We need mandatory registration and binding data access agreements. And we cannot have anonymous access, because then we would not have traceability, and that would open the door to biopiracy. And we need benefit sharing. There is a list of benefit sharing. I'm not enter into each and every detail. I believe Sangeeta covered most of these. But we need contracts that guarantee access to vaccines and treatments, and not voluntary commitments. I would not even call commitments. I don't like the word I put in this voluntary, whatever. So again, this is and what would make PABS an equitable system? There is a list of topics that we believe that the countries must take into consideration when, if we are really talking about equity inside the PABS system. So user registration and verification for all accessing pathogen data. This is number 0. Without that, all the promises of having an equitable PABS system fall apart. Because if we don't know who is accessing the data, the pathogen data, it's impossible to understand where this data is going, to what purpose, and what will be what will derive from this data. Will it become a vaccine? Will it become a diagnostic test? And if we don't have those answers, we cannot have the second step of the PAB system, which is the benefit sharing. PSI is also concerned about having a multilateral governance WHO PAB sequence database, because we cannot rely on private entities alone to enforce what it needs to be enforced in terms of traceability and user verification and binding contracts in terms of and conditions. We also need binding data access agreements with legal obligations by those that access those pathogen data and sequencing and database. We need track and trace mechanisms to prevent biopiracy. This is crucial. And binding contracts with guaranteed allocation of vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics, as you were saying, Alessandra. And also pre-negotiated non-exclusive royalty-free worldwide licenses by the WHO. This is crucial because PSI has been saying that since the TRIPS waiver debate. In a moment which the whole world needs this one technology, it's unreasonable, it's not rational to rely on only one supplier. This is why we need the pre-negotiated non-exclusive royalty-free worldwide licenses, because this is the way to expand the production and make sure that only one company will not control the demand and will not determine which country will receive which amount of this determined technology. But the EU and its allies, and this is where I'll answer your question, Alessandra. I remember some very interesting conversation we have had during week number 5 with some delegates, and it's mind blowing that to listen, for instance, by a particular delegate from a particular European country, that if we would to have a PABS system in the way that the developing countries and civil society and trade unions are defending, things would not be different than they were with COVAX. So what they're saying that your demands, they don't go much further than the COVAX facility, which is not true, we know, which is not true. COVAX was a voluntary, multi-stakeholder governed body. And this is something, the PAB system that we are defending here, that Sangeeta talked about, that we have been talking about for a number of years now, it really based on equity. And it would really change the status quo because it would create binding commitments. So instead of having user registration, the EU and allies calling it pragmatism and workable approaches, right? They are defending anonymous access to pathogen data. They prefer privately run databases. And they want the recipients informed of the requirements. I mean, when you're given a driver's license, if you're informed that you need to stop on a red light, it doesn't mean that you're going to, because you don't are legally bound to any laws or requirements that says what's going to happen to you if you don't comply with that rule, if you don't comply with that. So I can stop or not in a red light. I was informed that I need to, but in the end of the day, it will be my choice. And we know when we talk about big pharmaceutical transnational corporations that in the end of the day, their choice is profit. We need to make sure that we have a system that they don't have a choice to go all for the profits, that they need to be held accountable, to share, to set aside and to share the benefits either in fakes or in emergencies and so on and so forth. And the last topic I'd like to raise about the EU position is that they worried about discouraging participation from pharma companies. So this is kind of funny because the pharmaceutical corporations, again, they are moved by profits. So in a moment in which almost 9 billion people need a technology, they say, you know what, we are not going to access this data because it's not worth it. We're going to, direct our investments for like Chagas disease. We're going to direct our investments for leishmaniasis. I mean, of course not. They're going to pursue that disease or that virus or whatever that has the profit potential, but they need to do that in certain terms and conditions and rules in binding commitments. This is what the PAB system is trying to build. Because in the end of the day, anonymous access means digital biopiracy. So I try to put this together in a very blunt way, right? So developing countries share pathogens. There's an anonymous user that extracts data. With those data, that anonymous use have patents filed and have profits from that. In the end of the day, the developing countries will not have access to health technologies because those health technologies will be patented and they will be high priced, right? And these cycles mean business as usual. This is how we got here. And it's kind of crazy to think that the very reason why we are here is the system that is being defended right now. The same IP logic, the same monopoly logic, the same neoliberal logic of public risks, private profits. This is kind of mind-blowing, because it seems that we are, in circles. We are not getting out of the place that we started, right? And it seems that the whole pandemic agreement debate was made out of history, out of context, out of nowhere. We're not even in the planet Earth, it seems, right? And to this is my last slide, Alessandra, to conclude. We need global South solidarity and cohesion, and we need global South countries to stay together, to be vocal, and to be brave in this time of history. We have an opportunity now. And the Europeans and the EU, they're doing what they always done. They're betting on extractivism. They're betting on dividing countries, either from within or from themselves, right? In this same approach that has been going on for almost 600 years now. This is what is going on. So why coordinated positions matter in the Global South countries? And this is a call PSI is doing for Global South countries. Because then they would be, they will have more negotiating power. They would set the standards. They would prevent their division if they stay together, and they would protect their own sovereignty. We must always recall what happened to South Africa. In their goodwill, they shared the sequence information of the Omicron variant. And what happened? They didn't receive anything. They had their borders closed to receive like respiratories. They were excluded from everything. So we have a deadline, and I don't mean a deadline of a project. I don't mean a deadline of a negotiation as any other. I mean a deadline of a historical commitment that we need to do as humanity. We need binding contracts with guaranteed access. We need user registration and traceability. We need a public-led WHO governance pathogen database, and we cannot allow any room for anonymous biopiracy and extractivism. Equity is not a negotiable issue. Those are not technical details. It's a political decision, and millions and billions of lives depend on it. I'll end in Spanish because I think it comes from deeper in my heart. Seguimos en lucha y no vamos a retroceder. Thank you very much. See everyone in Geneva.
Thank you, Pedro. Thank you so much for this, I would say, very passionate and rightly so presentation, and also for your capacity of really highlighting the fact that although there are technical issues and there are technical matters, there's also technical discourse. In reality, what is lacking is the political willingness, and also to bring us to actually to the very roots and the very beginning of why we, not we, but why the countries have started and have embarked on this WHO pandemic agreement, and then with this conclusion that if things remain as they are, basically they have been negotiated for 5 years now for changing absolutely nothing. So
Alessandra,
thank you.
I have to do something that of course is not very polite, and I apologize deeply for that. I need to leave because I have a parent duty. So I'm very sorry. Please, I'll share my slides and my contact, so anyone wants to reach out. And thank you very much for the opportunity to share PSI position here.
Perfect. Thank you, Pedro. Thank you so much for joining us. And see you in Geneva.
See you. Bye-bye.
Yes. So moving on, and I see we're a little bit behind schedule. I am very happy now to present to you Alexandra Phelan. She is associate professor and senior scholar at the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, and she's also the faculty director at the Johns Hopkins Institute for Planetary Health. Her research examines pressing issues that are at the intersection of global health, climate change, and international law, including emerging infectious diseases, equitable benefit sharing, and global health justice. Beyond academia, she is an international lawyer and a global health advocate with law firms experience and also international organizations experience. She advises on legal, global governance, and public health policy issues related to international law and infectious diseases. And my question to you is whether we could focus a little more on the legal design and the enforceability of contracts within the PABS system. Could you maybe guide us and explain to us, maybe in a very pedagogical way, how the system could actually function in practice once the materials and the sequence informations are shared? And maybe in your answer, could you also give us a little hints whether maybe standard contracts could also help laboratories, scientists, researchers, and other commercial users in facilitating participation to the whole system. So I would leave it at that, and I would invite now you to speak. Thank you so much also for your patience, because I see we're a little bit running over time.
Thank you so much, Alessandra, and to all the organisers for today's event. I'm originally was a contract lawyer back in the day, and so I quite enjoy this opportunity to address some sort of fundamental pandemic and contract law matters. I'm going to sort of assume that many of us are very familiar with why the speed and efficiency of pathogen sample and sequence sharing is so important. So I'm going to assume that that is we're all on the same page there, and we note that we know that the a fragmented approach where there is friction, transaction costs, legal uncertainty, and delays that then ultimately cost lives. And that is really what we're trying to address if we're looking at standardized contracts in particular, and consistent frameworks for pathogen sample and sequence sharing for equitable benefit distribution. So I think where I'd like to start is at the end of your question there, Alessandro, is MTAs or material transfer agreements are not novel instruments for scientific and commercial communities that are engaged with pathogen sharing. Both commercial and non-commercial users currently are very familiar and operate with MTA frameworks quite routinely for biological material sharing, for data sharing, drug development, and international collaboration. This familiarity is a substantial advantage because it means that if the PABS system uses this same structure, we're applying very well-established procedures and understood processes. There is infrastructure already in universities, including legal departments and technology transfer officers who are well-versed in MTAs and standardized contracts, and scientists and researchers who are familiar with using them, their principles, and also abiding by contractual obligations. So standardization offers significant benefits that, in my view, substantially outweigh the perceived limitations. Legal certainty is the biggest benefit. When there is the same foundational framework that all transfers are operating under, we have legal certainty. All parties understand their rights and obligations from the very beginning. And for researchers, that means avoiding extended negotiations and the university bureaucracy. For companies, that means developing products with predictable timelines. Countries can rely on benefit sharing that is, again, standardized and through established mechanisms. And critically, standardized contracts enable the immediate transfer under these pre-established terms. And this is especially critical during the early stages of health emergencies, so even pre-FIG, when response speed directly correlates with lives saved. So equitable access is also much easier to achieve when we have clear, consistent rules that importantly enable small institutions or less resourced countries to participate on equal footing with major research centres and pharmaceutical companies. This standardisation of contracts creates a level playing field by eliminating the advantages derived from greater resources, legal resources as well. Enhanced compliance and monitoring becomes achievable through uniform agreements that allow for systematic tracking of transfers, compliance oversight, and verification that benefits are reaching originating countries as intended. And critically, contracts create direct enforceability between parties. Through privity of contracts, standardised MTAs establish binding legal relationships with clear remedies for breach. And unlike general terms of use or frameworks that may have less tailored enforceability, contracts provide direct legal recourse and dispute resolution mechanisms. Parties have standing to enforce legal obligations, seek specific performance, and obtain potentially, if included, damages for non-compliance, which are essential protections. I want to take a moment to now address what I consider one of the most significant misconceptions that has arisen around the use of standard contracts for pathogen transfers in recent years. And that's the argument that force majeure provisions render MTAs invalid or unenforceable during pandemics. It's a bit of an in-the-weeds argument, but it keeps coming up. So this reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of both force majeure doctrine and the nature of pandemic preparedness. So the legal threshold, pretty much in every jurisdiction, and this does not constitute legal advice specifically, but the legal threshold of force majeure is intentionally very high. Force majeure requires essentially not merely the occurrence of an extraordinary event, but that such event renders contractual performance genuinely impossible, not simply difficult or costly. The existence of a pandemic does not automatically invoke force majeure protections, demonstrated by the fact that much of force majeure boilerplate standard language has changed in recent years, which we'll talk about. Appropriately drafted MTAs for pathogen sharing, importantly, would explicitly anticipate pandemic scenarios. These are contracts that are developed explicitly with consideration for health emergencies and the materials that are most urgently required during pandemics, which directly address the foreseeability components of force majeure. When parties enter into agreements with full awareness that pandemic use represents a primary purpose, tribunals or courts are unlikely to excuse performance based on the occurrence of the anticipated event. So consider an example of emergency services contracts, which unfortunately are a thing that exists here in the United States. Fire departments can't simply invoke force majeure to avoid responding to fires merely because they constitute emergencies. The similar principle applies to pathogen sharing agreements. The force majeure doesn't make them just readily escapable. Thoughtfully designed MTAs contracts can incorporate pandemic triggers that expedite access during health emergencies rather than create obstacles. This might include things like automatic licensing provisions, accelerated benefit sharing, and clear priority frameworks for essential medicines. Further, so Swiss law, which is the predominant governing law chosen for PIP framework SMTA2s, has a particularly high bar that is stricter than most jurisdictions, and frustration of obligations due to force majeure does not result in automatic contract termination typically, but rather what adjustments or suspensions are feasible to still fulfill the terms of the contract. So I think there's, for countries, an important point to consider defining what force majeure explicitly means within either the standardized contracts or the sort of general principles, rather than leaving them to separate term sheets that may remain confidential. That is something that we've seen with the PIP framework SMTA2s. There really is no need to have force majeure left to confidential term sheets. They are not the typical terms that you would consider confidential, like financials, trade secrets, or non-standard terms that you would want to avoid being used as precedent in future negotiations. In fact, what we want here is perhaps to establish that precedent and make that clear. I don't want to go belabor the point, and I'm conscious of time and make sure Alan has time to talk. So let me just sort of move to some of the points that were raised in the chat. So standardized MTAs within the PABS system would establish an efficient, equitable framework for pathogen sharing that serves both preparedness and routine scientific collaboration. This is important for governments, pharmaceutical companies, academic researchers, and for all of us. So rather than decide who does and who does not sign a contract based on the type of entity that they are, I would recommend instead looking at the tiered contract provisions where core obligations apply universally and specific commercial obligations are limited to manufacturers and other commercial users, and non-commercial benefits sharing are also guaranteed to recognise the inequities that emerge in scientific endeavour between the global south and global north. For sequences, there are some legitimate practical arguments about why a terms of use approach may be more suitable than a bilateral contract approach, giving access through databases. But what I would say is that if a terms of use approach is taken, that we still consider these contracts and think about, firstly, for sequences, countries would benefit from agreeing to standardized minimum terms that must be included in database access terms for them to be recognized as PABS compliant. And B, these terms, in particular benefit sharing, must be made very clear to users for them to sufficiently understand the conditions of their sequence use and to capture their agreement to enter into those legally binding terms for enforceability. Just like MTAs, these standard terms could also be tiered on commercial or non-commercial use rather than trying to delineate based on user. I note there is, a lot of concern around the lack of time before the World Health Assembly. I do think that establishing at minimum the key principles for the contracts before finalising the annex does have several advantages. It ensures that annex provisions are designed to support effective contract implementation. It provides negotiating parties with a concrete understanding of how the system is going to function in practice, and getting agreement and consensus there is critical. And it avoids the risk of subsequent contract standard terms development undermining the compromises reached during the negotiations. The PIP framework's post-agreement contract development, whilst ultimately successful in terms of coming to standard contracts, it really delayed full implementation, and I think resulted in several loopholes and issues that we can talk about more. Ultimately, my final point is that contracts and legal certainty are not barriers to overcome, but rather tools to achieve our goals. Standardized contracts can transform our legal frameworks from sources of complexity into instruments of equity and accountability. Uncertainty undermines trust. Certainty and accountability rebuilds trust. So let's repair our roof while the sun is shining, so that when the next pandemic strikes, our response is governed not by ad hoc negotiations or unilateral government actions that are vulnerable to power imbalances, but the predictable operation of fair, transparent, and mutually beneficial legal commitments that rebuild the rule of law in pandemics. Thank you.
So much. Thank you so much for this presentation. Also for I'm very thankful that you were very mindful of the time. I think it really captured the point. You expressed it very, very in a very detailed way. Contracts, they are not the problem. They're not the barriers. They're the enablers. They're the tools. And that this is also what I remember in IGWG 5, many developing countries were saying, no? Trust goes through the contracts, through legal assurance. So thank you so much again for highlighting this point much better and with much detail. So I would now move to our last panelist of the day, which is Alan Maleche. Alan is the executive director of KELIN, which is the Kenya Legal and Ethical Issues Network on HIV and AIDS. Thank you. He's a lawyer and also a human rights advocate working at the intersection of law, health, and global policy. With 20 years of experience advancing rights-based approaches in health and human rights systems. So, Alan, so my question to you is, could you maybe explain to us how relevant is the PABS system in view also of the various bilateral deals that the United States is rushing to conclude with African countries? And when answering this question, could you also maybe highlight a little bit why contracts are important for the African continent, and why should the African continent care about the formulation of intellectual property provisions in the PABS system? I thank you so much, and now the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alessandra. I'll take as little time as possible because my colleagues have responded to some of the broader issues on contracts, intellectual property. I'll focus more on the African context and also cautious about time and also to try and engage colleagues. So first of all, thank you very much for joining and listening. I see many friends on the chat that I know who we have worked on these matters. And from an African perspective, discussions on the PABS systems are not only technical, they are also about trust in global health cooperation and preparedness for future emergencies. So many countries in the region, especially the African region, have contributed significantly to pathogen surveillance. If we talk about Ebola, if you talk about the whole issue of COVID, so they've played a very big role in rapid information sharing, and some have been very diligent in what they do. The key question now is how the global arrangements are evolving to ensure that the sharing is matched by predictable and equitable access, especially to the tools developed from that sharing. So I think for me, that's the context we need to approach this conversation for those of us who are on the African continent, but even some who are still in other global South countries that face the same challenges that Africa faces. So to your first question in terms of, could I explain how the PBS matters? And I think for many African countries, it's a very practical issue. My colleagues have spoken about during COVID, we saw how quickly scientific cooperation could happen. data and samples moved very rapidly, but access to vaccines and other health tools did not always follow the same pace. So this experience has shaped expectations around on three aspects in my view. One, clarity, predictability, and accountability. And that's what most, at least governments I've encountered with, are trying to push for in the current negotiations. Of course, not all of them, but a number of them. So definitely countries are concerned and are looking for assurance that the multilateral system, which is already facing a lot of threats for many other issues, will function effectively when the crisis occurs, because crises have occurred in other places and they have not functioned well. So I think the key message is that yes, the PBS matters, but where is the clarity? Where is the predictability? Where is the accountability? And will they really come into play when the crisis occurs? Or will we see governments and multilaterals taking a different direction to try and navigate out of the agreements they've agreed upon? In terms of the contract and IP aspect, I think the 2 or 3 key points I'll raise is that one of the central issues in these discussions is how the contractual arrangements are designed, and Alexandra has talked a bit about it. But from an African perspective, and drawing from the experience of my work with a few African governments, the equity will depend not only on principles, but how the obligations are defined in practice. And this includes timeliness for access, affordability conditions, and mechanisms that support response capacity during emergencies. IP or intellectual property provisions are also important. They're important in terms of shaping who is able to produce pandemic-related health tools and how quickly supply can expand when global demand increases. But you already have heard from Sangeeta around who again is pushing back on IP, and that doesn't come as a surprise. So again, the focus of most African countries, or a major of them, is ensuring that the legal and operational frameworks support both innovation and timely access. So contract and IP are important, but again, equity, the respect of the agreements that we already have on aspects of IP, the legal and operational frameworks, how do they exactly work? And then when you're dealing with all these things and people in Geneva and elsewhere negotiating, you're then dealing with a context where there are other countries going into bilateral agreements with individual countries. So in the continent of Africa, we've had about 14 or so countries that have already signed agreements with the US government. And that is sort of the global landscape that is evolving, where now countries are going directly to have bilateral health and security agreements while these conversations is going on. So drawing from my experience from Kenya, and which is something that's currently in court because the agreement has been challenged on various matters, including data governance. But my experience has been from the cooperation agreements, especially the ones in Kenya that we're involved in. They just illustrate how decisions around data governance, access pathways, and institutional responsibilities can have long terms. And the way most of these bilateral agreements, I wouldn't even call them bilateral agreements, they are just agreements, some that don't even sound binding, but have got binding language and non-binding clauses, but have got quite serious long-term implications where countries have signed them and have not thought them through. So I think the bilateral context that's happening now, it could be the US now, it could be another country later on, but it's reinforcing the importance of designing multilateral systems that remain credible and responsive to the national priorities. Because at the end of the day, the national priorities and sovereignty is very important. So I think for me, my key message as we close, as we go on with these negotiations, is around, and even learning from the experience that the US is showing in the bilateral agreement, how can we have continued coordinated engagement with African countries It's very important that we have that, because if they speak as a block, as a unit, it'll be helpful. Collective positioning would help ensure that the global rules reflect regional realities while strengthening the overall effectiveness of preparedness efforts. However, if African countries go individually, as they've done in many of the bilateral agreements, they will see that they'll be disadvantaged because each of them will have different and separate agreements that will not be useful for them in terms of going forward. And so as I conclude, I just want to pick on some of the questions that have come through on contracts in the chat. And to build on what Alexandra said, is just to say that the real value of the contracts will depend on how clearly obligations are defined and how they function in practice, particularly during emergencies and when the pressures for access is highest. And I think ultimately the confidence in the PABS system will depend on whether participation strengthens both global solidarity and national preparedness. Thank you for listening. I look forward to responding to questions, but if time doesn't allow, I'll drop my email in the chat and you can continue conversations with colleagues.
Thank you so much, Alan, for your intervention and also for being so mindful of the time. I feel honestly feel very bad because I think if you wanted, you should have taken more time, especially because you have waited for all 1 hour and a half to speak. But thank you so much. So I would like now also to ask with the other panelists. I know we are slightly over time. Would it be possible? I would really like to open now the panel for questions from the audience. Maybe mindful of the time, we could remain, let's say, 10 minutes maximum, and then we can also free our panelists and our speakers. But what does my panel say? Do we have time constraints? Also for the interpretations, because
For the interpretation, we have 25 more minutes.
Okay, then it will just be 5 minutes. And I'm also seeing, I'm also seeing Alexandra has to leave, unfortunately, but she has shared in the chat her email. Alexandra, thank you so much for joining us today. And if you have particular questions to her, she has left her email address, and I also see that also Alan is doing the same. Okay.
I think they cannot see the email address unless it's posted in the...
I'm sharing, yeah, I'll post here on the chat for everyone.
Okay. Perfect. Okay, so I have seen there were some questions from the audience in the Q&A box, but I've seen they have all been answered by our panelists. So, wow, how efficient. So now I am moving to the audience to see whether I see, oh, Moga. Moga, I see your hands is raised. Please, you can she speak? Okay, great. Moga, the floor is yours.
Wait, let me just 1 second. Then.
Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Yeah, okay. Just to say thank you for really, really interesting webinar and very useful. I just want to say it's not a question, it's just a really a request that our Alan, basically, we didn't really have chance to hear a lot about the impact or the relation between the MOU and the pandemic agreement, and if there is danger from the MOUs to the pandemic agreement negotiation, or it's an opportunity, I don't know. It's interesting that you said, Alan, that other countries might do the same. I expect the EU might do it as a bloc. So I think we need more time for that. Can we have a space next webinar for that? Thank you.
I would pass then this question maybe to Alan, if you have, if you want to detail your answer a little bit for a few minutes, and then to our colleagues from TWN. But you're
Thank
mute.
you.
Okay.
So, Moga, thanks for your question. Would need a whole session for that, but I feel
Exactly.
my quick question, my quick response would be this. Definitely these agreements are happening in parallel, but from what I've seen, at least from the Kenyan agreement, it's very vague and it's not very favorable to at least for us, it's a bit favorable because we have a strong constitution, but the ones I've seen from other countries are fairly vague. And I think if we get better aspects in the pandemic agreement, it'll be much better to have a standard because the closest we see are more geared to benefit the country that is giving money and not the recipient country to be able to respect national sovereignty. So if your country has weak data protection laws, if your country has weak laws around pathogen transfer and sharing of specimen, then you're likely to be in a very difficult position. And that's why my fear is that if African countries don't unite and get a good agreement that is covering well aspects of PABS, then it'll be problematic because their individual negotiations with the US government has shown every one of them have a different way to go. So I don't think the bilateral is a way to go. I think we need to have an agreed international standard that then African countries or any other countries can use that as a benchmark and say, this is what we've already agreed upon globally. As you're trying to get away from it, let's try to stick to this line. But for now, anyone can come and push them in a certain direction. And again, it's not fair negotiation because there are other things involved that are not even health related that make it difficult. But let's find the time to have that discussion on another webinar that Sangita will organize. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it was. I think it is true. We need a discussion on this. And I was just thinking about it yesterday itself. We have not really discussed this. I mean, if I were allowed the opportunity, I think I just want to echo. I think it goes both ways. So the PABS system, if it's a weak one, it undermines sovereignty, right, at the national level because you are in a weak capacity to negotiate bilaterally, right? Because everything, the materials, the sequence information are out there, it's already being exploited. So it weakens your negotiating hand bilaterally. And I think having a good PABS system is essential to ensure, that firstly equity and everything that we have discussed today, but it will set a particular benchmark as Ellen has mentioned. And I think we do need discussions on it. I think also to mention that Zimbabwe rejected the agreement, right, the bilateral deal. And I believe it is also Zambia that has rejected it, if I'm not mistaken, on the account that, these are very unfair deals, affect sovereignty. So the same principle applies to this international thing, especially when you see the text is really very much against what the developing countries have been arguing for. So I think the call for standing united is very important. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I see there is one other question in the chat, and I'm also think we only have a few minutes left to answer to this question. This is directed to Sangeeta. And Sangeeta, you are asked to elaborate on onward sharing obligations in the latest bureau text.
So in the latest bureau's text, there's some general reference when it comes to all the participants, except for the WHO Coordinated Laboratory Network. When it comes to other participants like entities using for commercial use, entities using for non-commercial use, it just says comply with applicable provisions regarding onward transfer, but it doesn't say what are the provisions. So it's this general thing. We just say you comply with some provisions, but it doesn't say what the provisions are. And so it does not say explicitly that there should be no onward transfer of the materials unless the third party has agreed to the same terms and conditions. Because if we just allow onward transfer without them agreeing to the same conditions, you are having free riders. And the entire PABS system will not last because there's a full undermining of the PABS system. So that is in relation to material, right? And when it comes to the material, when it comes to the WHO coordinated laboratory network, okay, it says onward transfer subject to certain provisions in some parts of the annex. But again, it does not say that, all of this will be underpinned by a standard contract. Yeah, so there are gaps in how the onward transfer is being dealt with, which creates a big loophole. Second point is, I was talking about materials. When it comes to PABS, the sequence information, right? It says that the provider shall upload the sequence information in the database, but then it says when it comes to onward transfer, the data, each user will follow the database own policy. Now, when we follow the policy, you'll see that most of these databases, as we have been discussing, allow anonymous access and have got no restrictions on onward transfer. So again, if you allow without some conditions the onward transfer, and it's not about preventing onward transfer, but just saying that when you transfer onwards, the prospective recipient is subject to the same terms and conditions. So you will need to have a data access agreement. The user should accept this data access agreement that will say this, that no onward transfer unless the subsequent third party has also accepted the same conditions. So then you have a PABS system that even as the material and sequences get transferred, are within an accountable system, right? Otherwise, we're just creating a system that is open to exploitation. And the short word for it is biopiracy. So WHO just will become a forum of biopiracy of resources that are being shared. And I don't think anybody wants to really see that.
Okay, thank you so much, Sangeeta. I know we have to close. I would therefore kindly ask both you and Alan a very quick last few comments on the role that civil society and community voices can play. This is a question that was written in the chat by Sam Prasad, which also had his hand raised before, but now I don't see it anymore. So, but that's also a nice concluding question, like moving from the legal, technical, political, and what actually we as civil society can do. And it's also a big question, but I'll give both of you 1 minute each,
Sure.
and then we really need to close.
I'll take half a minute. I think definitely civil society has a role to play, and drawing from the Kenyan experience, they played it in three ways. One, there was the use of the media to hold government accountable on what they're negotiating on bilateral agreements, but also to continue to hold the government accountable to remind them that they were negotiating something else in the Geneva, and they needed to ensure that both things are aligned and in line with the Kenyan law. So the use of the media to hold the government accountable is critical, and to also push that some of these documents be made public, be it the bilateral agreements or to the extent possible, the negotiating language that is happening in Geneva. The second thing then, when these agreements are made available, civil society scrutinized it. They wrote advisories to governments. And so again, joining forces with other people in other sectors who are likely to be affected by this kind of agreements or this kind of negotiations is key to be able to send advisories to your government. And then lastly, drawing from our experience in Kenya, trying to use the court system if it's favorable to challenge some of these things if they are violating national law, because at the end of the day, your government is responsible to its citizens and you can test the water. So definitely, I agree civil society is important. They have a role to play. And most importantly, for those who understand the legal terminologies, they need to break them down in a way that every normal person can understand and see what are the risks in the direction governments may be taking when they sign on and what the provisions say. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to more interactions on this.
Oh, would you like me to? I think Alan
If
has.
you have, yes.
Yeah, Alan has already addressed the point. I think, yeah, we play a very important role, in terms of bringing the evidence, bringing the information together, putting forward the analysis and holding governments accountable from the north as well as from the south. Because at the end of the day, I think we have a responsibility. Like I said, the context here is not your normal context, right? It's the context of health emergency, and I think we have a responsibility to ensure that the outcome that comes out is an outcome that is fair, equitable, and that delivers, in terms of what it's supposed to do in equity. And I think that can, the idea that we can have an unaccountable, inequitable PABS system and somehow it can work for public health and, just benefit, even the developed countries, it's nonsensical. I think a system that is not fair or accountable will not work for anyone, and it will definitely not work for even the users. So I think this is something the truth of which we need to bring to the global north because of their strong objection, which they are just not justified objections as we have discussed. So I think we play a very important role in all of these different areas. Thanks.
Thanks to you, and thank you very much also to Alan for your answer. I also would like to extend all my gratitude to all the audience who has remained here with us 20 minutes over our time. I would also like to express my thanks to the interpreters, which I know have always have hard work to do. And to all the panelists, unfortunately, two of them have left us already, but Alan and Sangeeta, thank you so much. Thank you also so much to Rania, which behind the scenes sort of pulled out all the strings of these webinars together. And before leaving you, I just wanted to remind you that this was the first of 2 sessions webinars. Today we discussed about contracts in intellectual property, but tomorrow we will discuss about anonymous access to PABS sequence information. Trying to answer this question, open access or open exploitation, with very, very interesting and prepared panels of speakers. So please, if you have not registered yet, go to the TWN website or also the G2H2 website and please register. The time is the same at 2 o'clock and always on Zoom. And with this, I would really like to thank you all and wish you a pleasant afternoon, evening, or morning, wherever you are.
Thanks, Alessandra.